In this video, we're going to discuss the relationship between comic book writer Jeff Lemire's run on Marvel Comics' Moon Knight, and how it relates to a classical Greek interpretation on the concept of knowledge and thought. The discussion comes to you in three main parts: a summary of Moon Knight Lunatic, a summary of Plato's allegory of the cave, and an analysis on how the two relate to each other. Part 1. Moon Knight and Lunatic. In late 2015, Marvel Comics decided to reinvigorate their publication by operating under the banner of All New, All Different Marvel, wherein many of the comic book series would explore themes and scenarios that their characters typically hadn't seen before. One of the titles to come out of All New, All Different Marvel was Moon Knight, written by Jeff Lemire and drawn by Greg Smallwood. Originally, Moon Knight was a young mercenary by the name of Marc Spector. After dying during a mission to raid an ancient Egyptian tomb honoring the moon god Khonshu, Marc found himself spontaneously revived by the very same god. Seeking redemption, Marc went on to operate as a vigilante of Khonshu, fighting to both thwart crime as well as to protect all night travelers as Moon Knight. However, unlike most other vigilantes who only have two identities, their personal life and their life as a hero, Marc felt he could operate more efficiently by adopting two more personas. One being the lucrative Stephen Grant, who was wealthy through the money Marc made during his mercenary years and funded Moon Knight's adventures, and the other being taxi driver Jake Lockley, who helped gather street-level intel on crime in the city of New York. With these four identities, Marc Spector went about as an urban vigilante under Khonshu's guidance and protection. However, under All New, All Different Marvel, Moon Knight found himself under more abstract circumstances. Instead of living between his four established lives, Marc Spector awakens one night and finds himself a patient at a mental hospital, with abusive wardens and former friends who no longer recognize him. He's told that he was never Moon Knight, but rather a mentally ill patient with dissociative identity disorder, who has been a ward of the asylum since his childhood. However, after encountering a friend by the name of Crawley, Marc begins to suspect that not everything may be as it seems. After attempting to escape the asylum as a makeshift Moon Knight, Marc is able to see his wardens as well as all of New York as under the dominion of the Egyptian god Set. However, after being apprehended by the hospital faculty, Marc's mask is removed and he sees the world again without a single hint of the devastation he had previously seen. From here, Marc is set on escaping the asylum. He gathers a small team of former friends to break out of the asylum in the middle of the night. Along their escape route, they find themselves in ancient Egyptian hallways, tombs, and other absurd places. Marc finds himself tumbling through an Egyptian New York, the moon as an astronaut, the movie set of Stephen Grant, and the streets of Jake Lockley, until he finally makes it to the god Set, only to find out that the god has had nothing to do with New York's current state. Determined to find the real culprit, Marc chases after a Moon Knight imposter, wounds him, and learns that the mastermind between Spector's lunatic adventure was in fact his patron god Khonshu. Under the pretext that his current form is growing weak and dying, Khonshu claims that he had done everything in his power to weaken Marc Spector's mind enough so that he can usurp it and take his body for himself. Frustrated by this revelation, Marc not only refuses Khonshu's advances, but also goes so far as to rebel against him, by jumping off to commit suicide. However, upon hitting the pavement of New York, Marc awakens in the bed of the lavish apartment of Stephen Grant, and stares off into the city with a single tear in his eye, while Jeff Lemire leaves the reader with an inquisitive, "The end?" Part 2. Plato and the Allegory of the Cave. So Marc Spector's adventure throughout Lunatic may seem outlandish and insane through its combination of Egyptian mythology and mental illness, but perhaps it can be better understood through the philosophical perspective of one of the oldest and most famous philosophers of the Western world, Plato of Athens. Plato was a classical Greek philosopher who held a particularly big focus on the subject of epistemology, the theory of knowledge and what it means to truly know something. A big belief that Plato held was that the world in which we as people inhabit was not as it superficially appears. Plato was a big proponent of the idea that there existed higher planes of reality, which revealed the truths that we could not initially see in our lives. I'd like to explain this before I go on, but in this philosophical discussion, the word reality is meant to communicate the idea of an entire world or way of life. As Plato explains in his work Timaeus, there is a third nature, which is space, which is eternal, and admits not of destruction, and proves a home for all created things, and is apprehended without the help of sense, by a kind of spurious reason, and is hardly real, which we behold as a dream, say of all existence, that what is neither in heaven nor in earth has no existence. This third nature, as Plato describes, is a pure plane of reality which perfectly holds all essential knowledge. However, unlike the reality that we inhabit, it cannot be reached through physical travel, but rather through intellectual comprehension, that is, the search for the most true and absolute knowledge. Plato's ideas were undoubtedly abstract and theoretical, but as a man with such complex thoughts and opinions, Plato sought to make his ideas clear to his peers through the art of storytelling and allegorical relationships. An allegory is a story wherein the characters, the setting, and the entire plot meant to represent a higher symbolism beyond itself. In Plato's work, The Republic, Plato presents a famous dialogue that is commonly known as the allegory of the cave. In this dialogue, Plato describes a circumstance wherein some men are chained within a dark cave with a fire behind them. These chained men are forced to have their backs to the entrance of the cave, and so they can only see whatever shadows are cast by the fire. The people of the outside world that pass by the entrance present shadows that project upon the walls of the caves, so the closest that these men have ever known to a bird or a chair are merely the shadows of birds and the shadows of chairs. And furthermore, these men also have no idea of grander experiences that cannot exist within the cave, such as the sky or the ocean. Most every person would say that these men do not truly know about their world, for all that they know are merely a limited number of shadows. Now the collection of these shadows inside their cave is their reality. It's their entire world. Now suppose that one of the men were to be unchained for a brief period of time. This man wanders out of the cave and into the outside world, where he sees the truer reality of the shadows he had previously seen. He sees real birds and real chairs in the three-dimensional form rather than their two-dimensional shadows. Fascinated and literally enlightened, the man returns to the cave to tell his fellow prisoners. But they do not believe him. For how could they? The man didn't have the time or the power to bring back any sort of proof of what the outside world was really like. And furthermore, in the eyes of his peers, the sun had blinded the free man, harming his sight and making it nearly impossible to return to seeing the world of shadows that existed within the cave. Now the allegory to the scenario should be clear. The world and reality of the cave and its shadows is representative of a certain style of life and understanding that people have become accustomed with. Meanwhile, the outside world and its blinding light is representative of new knowledge and the realization that a person's circumstances and understandings were in fact not as they initially seemed. While Plato makes note of the skepticism from peers that understanding and enlightenment consequentially yield, he still emphasizes that truer knowledge and a more pure form of reality should still be sought, because only through truth can we grow and meaningfully live as people. Part 3. Synthesis and Analysis. But tying the discussion back to Moon Knight, the relationship between Marc Spector in Lunatic and the prisoners of Plato's allegory of the cave lies in their thematic use of truth and reality in their stories. Unlike the men of the cave, Marc Spector did not grow up living in the false reality of the mental hospital. Instead, his circumstance is much more of that of the returning free man, having known the truth of the world and their circumstances, but whose words fall upon deaf ears. Comparisons can also be drawn between the two stories through the symbolisms that they use. The sun and masks. The concept of masks is an important symbol in Jeff Lemire's story, as it serves a similar role to the sun in Plato's original text, simultaneously granting and obscuring perception. In the beginning of Marc Spector's adventure, it was only by wearing the makeshift mask, and therefore adopting the identity of Moon Knight, that he could see the orderlies of the hospital as the demons that they truly were. And yet, as we see when he loses his mask, he is no longer able to see his surroundings as an Egyptian landscape. Confident that things are not truly as they superficially seem, Marc is further labeled as a crazy man, much like the free man once he returns to his peers. In this scene, the mask is following the role of enlightenment, like Plato's sun when the chain man leaves the cave. The mask, like the sun, allowed him to see what he could not see before, and when he no longer had the aid of the mask, he was labeled a madman. Ultimately, Jeff Lemire's writing and Greg Smallwood's illustrations do an excellent job of portraying the essential concept of truth in Plato's philosophy. As Plato emphasized, there are other levels of truth in our world that should be sought after, since they grant us greater and truer knowledge. Lunatic also demonstrates one of the biggest conflicts in pursuing the Platonic idea of reality and truth: the uncertainty that one has indeed finally reached the ultimate truth. In the end of the story, when Marc Spector seeks to commit suicide and awakens in his other persona, Stephen Grant, we as the reader are left to wonder if this circumstance is indeed the most truthful reality. That is to say, that all his adventures in Lunatic were just a dream. Or if this scene is once again not as it seems. Plato's allegory of the cave went on to become the foundation of the more skeptical approaches towards epistemology, as seen in future philosophers such as René Descartes and Immanuel Kant. Justly so, the paranoia of whether or not Marc's surroundings are real, or if they're just another illusion, paves the way for the reader's skepticism towards the ending. And if Moon Knight were to have indeed ended right there in the final panel of Stephen Grant staring off into New York, it would have been a beautifully executed cliffhanger.